Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast this week. Joe Ellis and I talking about the alien and sedition laws and the naturalization law of 1798. And you would think, well, what are we doing? Just talking about some ancient thing in American legal history? No. Because as you know, Donald Trump has invoked the Alien Enemies Law, which is still on the books. The Sedition Law of 1798 sunsetted in 1800. The Alien Friends Law of 1798 sunsetted in 1800. The Naturalization Law has long since been rescinded. So the one that was still on the books, that remains on the books, and if a law is on the books, you can invoke it. You shouldn't, because that was 200 years ago in a very different America. But you can. You have every legal right to invoke a law whenever it was passed, as long as it hasn't been repealed, rescinded, or amended out of its purposes. And so the Alien Enemies Law continues to exist. It's been updated a couple of times. It was used by Woodrow Wilson in the aftermath of World War I. It was used by FDR with respect to Japanese internment camps. It was invoked by Harry S. Truman. Trump is not the first person to go back to the Alien Enemies Act, so we shouldn't confuse ourselves about that. However, the law was passed during a war scare. Whenever a law is passed during a war scare, we should think very carefully about whether we want to keep it on the books. Think of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was passed within weeks of 9/11. What does that tell you? It had been sitting on a shelf. It had been crafted. It was a very long act. The government of the United States uses these occasions, or those who want strong government use these occasions to pass legislation during panic that would not pass under what the late John McCain called regular order. So the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was passed during a war, a quasi war, a time of great fear that the French Revolution was going to spill over into America, which in some limited, very, very limited respects it did. Here's what's wrong with it. Not just that that's 200 years ago, but it doesn't allow due process. It didn't allow a hearing. There was no evidence. There was no habeas corpus. The president could pick out somebody. I mean, it wasn't Lafayette, but let's just take that as a French name. If Lafayette had been here and John Adams had wanted him gone, all he would have had to say was, I write an order expelling Lafayette from this country. You have 90 days or 60 days to get out, after which you would be arrested for a 3-year prison term. No due process. My friends, the very heart and soul of a constitutional republic, no matter what your politics, no matter how much you hate Venezuelan gangs, no matter how much you're against lawlessness by some immigrants, no matter how much you think the border needs to be controlled, whatever your politics, we're Americans, and we stand for constitutional due process. And the Alien Enemies Law allowed the president unambiguous, total, unilateral power to expel undesirable foreign nationals. That's not okay. If you're going to have it, I mean, maybe we need it. Maybe we do need to get at the mayhem and violent and drug pushing class of people who somehow get over our borders. Maybe we do need to get at that. Of course we do. But we do it in America with due process. I can't think of any justification of unilateral power without due process to do something as grave as expel or incarcerate some undesirable person from some other country. And at that time it was France or Haiti, back in 1798. We're going to be in for an interesting ride here. But I want everyone who's listening to know I don't believe that we should decry Donald Trump for trying to do what he wants to do with this country. We elected him twice after an interim. He's never made it a secret of what he plans to do. He was talking about reinvoking the Alien Enemies Law back in 2024 on the campaign trail. So he told us what he wanted to do. We watched him for 4 years, more really, but for 4 years in the presidency. We knew a lot about his behavioral style, and he won. So now it's up to the other two branches of the national government to check anything that violates the constitutional order. Amazing. I love talking with Joe. He's an amazing man. He's written a ton of books. They're award-winning. He's spectacular. He's at the end of a long and brilliant career. Still writing, however, still publishing, still doing op-ed pieces, still being interviewed. What a great joy. The Friends group is up and running. You can join at a number of levels. If you join at the higher levels, you get incredible amounts of bonus content. There will be periodic Zoom meetings. There will be extra pieces of interviews. There will be dispatches that I write that aren't published in any other way. You'll get first chance at cultural tours and online courses and so on. There are many advantages, frankly, that did not exist under the old 1776 Club. We decided if we're going to do it again, we're going to do it right. And that's going to put enormous burden on us to keep the content coming and to make sure that the Friends are richly rewarded for contributing to the success of this program. So please do go to ltamerica.org, join the Friends group at the level you can afford or higher, and then make sure you signed up for the newsletter. And if you think we're doing good work, tell people that, yes, Jefferson's still part of it. We still talk a lot about the Founding Fathers. I am a thoroughgoing Jeffersonian, and that's how I see the world. That's the world I want to live in, minus questions of race and slavery and so on. And now with our focus on 2026, the 250th birthday of the United States, I'm trying to create a report card about America, and I want you along for the ride. I want you to be part of it. And beginning in about 6 weeks, I'll be leaving Bismarck for North Carolina to pick up my Airstream, and then on the road with Lewis and Clark through all of the rest of 2025. I can't wait. You wait till you hear of some of the adventures we have in mind. So let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm Clay Jenkinson, and back by popular demand, the man hiding in an undisclosed location in Vermont, the eminent professor, Joe Ellis. Joe, I'm so glad you're here. We have so much to talk about. You and I, over the years, have mentioned from time to time the Alien and Sedition and Naturalization Acts of 1798. Who would have thought we'd be talking about them as relevant today? Welcome, Joe.
'Tis true. They were passed in 1798, just as you say, by the Federalist Party. There were two parties then. One were called Federalists, the other were called Republicans. You'll see some textbooks say Democratic Republicans. That's not really right. One of the ironies is the head of the Federalist Party was John Adams, who was president. Head of the two leaders of the Republican Party were Thomas Jefferson, whom I think you know something about, and his colleague, also fellow Virginian, whose name is James Madison. And if we look at the acts from our present perspective, they were a horrific mistake by Adams. He later acknowledged that. And one thing, in order to recover the context of that 18th century moment before we come to the present, the founders hadn't foreseen political parties. And when they came into existence and started behaving in an extraordinarily aggressive way, they didn't know how to deal with them. So that Jefferson actually hired a scandalmonger whose name is James Callender. You remember him.
That was mere grocery money for a person who was indigent. Come on. Jefferson always said he didn't hire him. He was just supporting him because he was poor.
Callender later published the letters that Jefferson wrote him that showed that, in fact, that's exactly what he'd done. And Callender wrote a couple of pieces anti-Adams, saying that Adams intended to crown himself king and make John Quincy his successor. Both were lies.
I think he called him a hermaphrodite, didn't he? John Adams, he called Adams a hermaphrodite.
I didn't know that. And there were Frenchmen coming into the country who were under the influence of anti-Americans who were calling for the removal of Adams as president. So there were reasons why Adams signed it. And by the way, George Washington also endorsed it.
So just to back up for a minute, Joe, so everyone stays with us in this, it's a very volatile time. Founding Fathers hadn't anticipated political parties, but they're beginning to gel. Then we're in a quasi war, an undeclared naval war with France in 1798. And there's a lot of war fever, there's overreaction, there's deep concern that the French might invade. These people that were coming from Haiti, these refugees from the Haitian Revolution, were usually on the Jeffersonian side of the political equation, and everyone was freaked out about the French Revolution and not wanting something like that to happen here. So it was a time of paranoia. And then Adams' Congress, which was a barely Federalist Congress. He didn't have huge majorities, but they passed the Alien Law. Yeah. They passed 4 laws: the Alien Friends Law, the Alien Enemies Law, the Naturalization Law, and the Sedition Law. And these were all attempts to protect the country, to discourage dissent, and to make sure we could get people that were undesirable from a national security perspective out of the United States. So I've made the best case I can for them.
You did a good job. It was it was a good summary of those forces, and that Adams wasn't the man behind the legislation, but he signed it.
He was a little reluctant, wasn't he? I mean,
he was, and he later said to Jefferson, "You signed it too."
He was vice president. That was unfair.
Vice president, you're right.
Vice president signs as a matter of form.
But after the fact, not too much later, after he retired from the presidency, Adams said it was the biggest mistake, one of the biggest mistake of his presidency. When we look back to it from our perspective now, I think that President Trump is the leading force behind the legislation, or it's not even legislation, but the behavior towards aliens, towards immigrants, and hostile to the press that doesn't treat him as he thinks he should be treated. So he's the leading force here. It's not coming from the Congress, although the Republicans in Congress support him. It's coming directly from Trump himself.
And maybe his henchman, Stephen Miller. But again, let me back up for just a minute, Joe. So, okay, these laws passed in 1798. A couple of things. They had sunset clauses in 2 of them. So the Alien Friends Law sunsetted in 1800, in other words, no longer in force, and the Sedition Law sunsetted in 1800, no longer of any force. But the Alien Friends Act was not rescinded or retired, and that means it's been on the books all this time, and it can be reinvoked, and it has been invoked a number of times by Truman, by FDR, by Woodrow Wilson, and now by Donald Trump. Another thing that I think it's important for our listeners to know, Joe, is that not only was this a grave mistake by the Federalists and the Adams administration, but it led probably to the election of Jefferson in 1800, because he said, as you know, that these acts were worthy of the 8th or 9th century, that this was medieval barbarism and in direct violation of the Bill of Rights, a direct violation of natural law, and that it couldn't be permitted to stand. And Jefferson went away, a bit of a hothead at times, and wrote the Kentucky Resolutions, which said that if the federal government oversteps itself and there's no check and balance at the federal level, then the states might have to intervene and refuse to enforce those sort of barbaric laws or unconstitutional laws within their own jurisdiction. So a lot went on here, and it probably elected Jefferson in 1800, didn't it?
Right, it's true. And Jefferson's position on that in the Kentucky Resolution is really a claim that the states can refuse to obey the law.
Nullify.
Nullification. Yeah. When Adams lost the presidential election in 1800 to Jefferson, it was a close election. Now, some people think it was the reason they call Jefferson the Negro president was that he won it because of the 3/5 clause. Adams said that losing the election was the proudest moment of his political career.
Why?
Because he lost the election, he thought, because he had insisted on signing a treaty with France, which made him unpopular in the Federalist Party. And he knew that was the right thing to do. And this was that's what a leader is supposed to do the right thing. It's right for the collective, even if it's not right for your political career.
So Adams believed, I think, you tell me if this is an exaggeration, that the surest measure of his own virtue and greatness was when he was unpopular doing the right thing against the mobs or the people out there who don't understand.
That is correct. I mean, what's the watchword during the founding? It's this word that you have to be able to focus exclusively on what's on the collective interest, the res publica, things of the public interest, and not on your own career.
And the whims of the crowd, the whims of the mob, the waves of popular opinion that circulate.
That's right. Can you imagine someone insisting on those criteria in the House and Senate today? But that's what makes the founders different. And in some sense, you see, they're all people who claim to have come from the revolution and to have taken a position of strength in a cause that was quite, it could have lost easily, should have lost. They're fighting the number one political and economic power in the world. And if they lost, they would all be hanged. They knew that. There was a moment during the debate over Jefferson's words. Oh, no, it was a debate over after they voted on independence. A member of Virginia who was very fat came up to what's the man? Harris. That's right, Harrison. And Harrison comes up to the guy from Massachusetts after whom
Elbridge Gerry,
and he says to Gerry, "I'm lucky, Mr. Gerry, because I'm fat." And you're very unlucky because you're very thin, because when they catch us to hang us, I'm going to die quickly and you're going to have to hang for a very painful moments. And
you'll be twisting and squirming up there.
When Jefferson said our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, he wasn't kidding. That it's a lyrical way to talk about the fact they were all in a game which they didn't really know whether they were going to win or not. But people coming out of that kind of political context were more predisposed to see that the collective interest had to take precedence. And that's really how we got that strange contraption called the Electoral College, too.
The Alien Friends Act, which is sunsetted, no longer in effect, said that the president could deport anyone who was foreign-born that he regarded as a security risk without due process and without a hearing. In other words, if John Adams decided that Frenchman somebody was a security risk, he could simply order him out of the country and there was no appeal of any sort. Now, this was never actually invoked, but it had a really depressing effect on dissent, and everyone was scared, and many people left voluntarily so as not to get ground up in it. That act sunsetted. The Alien Enemies Act was passed the same year, and it gave the president even greater power to deport people from the country, especially during times of war, insurrection, and invasion. And that act is still on the books. And then just two more. The Sedition Law, if you can imagine it, Joe, this is why Jefferson said these are worthy of the barbarous moments of the Middle Ages. The Sedition Law said the president and his administration could prosecute anybody who wrote negative things about the work of that administration. That's a very broad brush, and about a dozen people were ground up in the Sedition Law before it sunsetted in 1800. And then finally, the Naturalization Law, part of that cluster, raised from 5 to 14 years the amount of time you had to be in this country if you were a foreign national before you could apply for citizenship. No wonder Jefferson thought these were appalling.
Mm-hmm. Now, remember, at that stage of the game, there's not that many people coming into the United States. It's a much smaller number. I think that if the current president were looking for some historical precedents to support his case that he has the right to do what he's doing, he'd be able to find it back there.
He needs a better historian. We need to take a break. I'm talking with my friend, the eminent, the great Joe Ellis. In much demand on this program, we're talking about the Alien and Sedition laws and the Naturalization Law, which were maybe the greatest mistake of the presidency of John Adams. And now they're back. We'll take a short break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the current status of the law. Stay tuned, everyone. welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm sitting with my good friend, Joe Ellis. Joe, I so enjoy working with you. We started working together in the studios of Ken Burns long ago. We were the hecklers. We almost got thrown out. We almost got tossed off not only the set, but out of the movie, because you and I were in the back like a couple of creeps, heckling and making snide comments. And there was one professor, one talking head who was quite, deeply sensitive and precious in some ways. And you and I both found that a little nauseating, I think. And so at one point, Ken Burns turned to us and said, "You two, shut up or get out." And
I remember that he wanted to use a photograph of a slave that was from the Civil War era, at the back of a slave. It was all scarred up.
Yeah.
And we said, "You can't use that. That's a Civil War thing. It's not a 18th century picture." Jefferson never whipped his slaves. Ken just said, poetic license.
Yeah, it may be bad history, but it's good film. So, Joe, let's go to the current situation. So I want to repeat. The Alien, Sedition, and Naturalization Acts of 1798, that's 200 years ago, passed by a Federalist-dominated Congress during the war scare, the Quasi War in the Adams administration. Adams was somewhat reluctant to sign them. He didn't promote them, although his wife did. And he later regarded this as a mistake that he had made, and it probably did help to diselect him and make him a one-term president. Jefferson and his followers made the most of this, of course, as you might expect. And some of the convictions under the sedition law were appalling and ridiculous by our standards. Of course, we aren't the ones that were thrown in jail. Most of that is gone forever. It's just a footnote to history. It's hardly ever talked about. I'm shocked that we're talking about it now, Joe. But President Trump, during the campaign in 2024, said he was going to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, which is still on the books. And on March 15th, he did invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and he has begun to use it. Already there have been several deportation flights, but do you know where they go? I did not know this. They're going to an American terrorism compound in El Salvador. Boy, that makes that is really, really, really upsetting that you lived through the whole El Salvador crisis of the 1980s, and to think that we now have a terrorist detention center. This isn't Guantanamo. This is the nation of El Salvador. Anyway, several of those flights went. So James E. Boasberg, U.S. District Judge James E. Boasberg, immediately stayed the order. In other words, he said no more deportations, no more arrests under the Alien Enemies Act until such time as this can be adjudicated. And you and I both know this is almost certainly going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we don't know what the Supreme Court will decide about this.
No, we don't. I think the key issue is whether the act requires you to be at war at that time. The judge who stopped it was arguing, in addition, that you couldn't take these alleged criminals unless you had demonstrated clearly that they were all guilty. They were all, the fact that they had markings on their arms, tattoos, doesn't necessarily means they're people in gangs that are opposed to the United States.
Venezuelan gangs, cartels, people that President Trump and his administration regard as palpably the wrong people to have in this country.
Right, but what the Trump team did, though, was simply disregard the judge's opinion, and then Trump himself made statements that the judge ought to be impeached, and then the Chief Justice said,
John Roberts stepped in at that point, didn't he?
And said, no, you should. That's not the way to go. You can appeal the case, and that's the proper way to go. I think even the Supreme Court will find the Trump argument unconstitutional, which will disappoint him. But that if they can demonstrate the people that they took are criminals, then I think that he will have the authority to move them.
Here's what really bothers me about this, Joe. I mean, I'm going back all the way to 1798. It's one thing in a time of international uncertainty or crisis or undeclared war to pass legislation like this. We understand it. We get it, whether we agree with it or not. but without due process, without a hearing, without right to counsel, without evidence to be presented in a court of law. I mean, the very essence of Western civilization's modern jurisprudence is due process, hearings, habeas corpus, trial by jury, or at least trial when you have rights to counsel and to see the information that's being used against you. The Alien Enemies and Alien Friends laws of 1798 gave the president absolute, unambiguous, unchecked power to say that guy has to go. And that's dangerous. That's why Jefferson was so profoundly outraged by it. And to think that now Joe, it's 200 years later. I mean, think of all the gains we have made in due process and the Miranda decisions and right to counsel and the Fifth Amendment and so on. We've come a long, long, long way in basic human justice and fairness since 1798. And to think that that law has been dragged out of the hoary past when there's no substantial due process involved in it, that's really not America.
Well, I think that I agree with you, but I don't think that Donald Trump thinks the way you and I think. Donald Trump does not acknowledge the rule of law, and he feels he has the right to take the kind of action that he does. And, on his various networks, he's telling his true believers that, and it plays to, what he's saying throughout his campaign, that one of the major issues that got him elected was his posture on immigration. I would put it this way: if you have two political candidates and one of them is telling you who you should love and the other one is telling you who you should hate, the second one will win most elections.
Hate wins, you think?
Yeah.
So, Joe, the argument that the Trump administration is likely to make when this goes up the chain of the court system, the U.S. court system, is that we are at war. We're at war with a new kind of war. Asymmetrical war. This is not Poland, Germany, Britain, and France in 1939. This is a whole different ballgame. We have porous borders, and fentanyl is coming in, and these gangs are coming in, and they're wreaking havoc on our cities, and it's almost impossible for us to get them out. And we have these asylum cities. And I mean, for Donald Trump, it's a nightmare. He looks at this and sees a nightmare, and he says, we are at war. This might be war in air quotes, but it is war. And therefore, we must have the authority to do this. And he will say, I feel certain, we can't allow this to be locked up for years at a time in appeals and due process and counter appeals and so on. We just got to get this done if we're going to make America great again. So you can hear him saying those things, can't you?
I can. It's ironic because getting them all delayed and never acted on is the way he avoided going to jail for 4 years in the trials that he was threatened with. I think the argument that we're really at war is a weak argument. There might be certain people on the court that would go along with the Supreme Court. I think it'll lose at the next level, and then, as you say, go to the Supreme Court. The other truth is that all of the immigrants coming into this country are not vermin.
No, the 90 or 95% of them are people just wanting a little piece of the pie.
The immigration is the secret sauce of the American economy. If you remove these people, now you're going to destroy the construction industry, the architectural industry. We're dependent on those people. They fill jobs that nobody else will fill. And at the higher level, some of the major corporations in the world are headed by immigrants. These are the other kind of immigrants that nobody talks about. So that the posture, and we're all immigrants. I mean, I've got an Irish side and a German side, and the Trump message makes great sense to the cult that is his base. But I think that we're going to discover that when they try to remove a lot of these families, there are going to be cities and towns that are going to rise up in opposition to protect them because they're neighbors and they're friends. Their kids go to school with yours, and they're well-regarded members of American society. And attempting to demonize them, I think, might work in a campaign, but I'm not sure it's going to work in fact.
Well, we'll see, won't we? Two things there. One is that the Alien Citizen Naturalization laws of 1798 had an effect on the 1800 election and may have elected Jefferson to displace his old friend, John Adams, Jefferson, third president, John Adams, one-term second president. We'll see if there is a political price that President Trump and his cohort pay for this extraordinary thing. The second thing I want to say, Joe, and I know you're going to agree with me, is that if that law was not sunsetted and it's still on the books, and actually it has been updated a couple of times in the course of American history with some amendments, but if the Alien Enemies Law is still on the books of the United States and has never been repealed or rescinded, Donald Trump has every right to invoke it and to use it if he can. I think we need reform to say after X number of decades, if a law hasn't been used, it's automatically sunsetted. But the fact is, he has every constitutional right to revive that 1798 statute and try to apply it in his own time if he can get away with it. We'll see. The courts will determine this. But you agree, don't you, that he's not just making something up. This was a law, and it has never been repealed.
True, but the law says you have to be at war.
Right.
And that's a big if. Is that the law that was used against the Japanese at World War II?
FDR invoked it first, and then Truman did it in a huge scale.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, how do you like to be thrown in with the person who's responsible for the Japanese experience? I mean, that's one of the most embarrassing moments in American history.
Do you know who the president who invoked this act most of any president? I mean, like thousands of people. Woodrow Wilson, during the Red Scare, the crazy scare, the war scare, 1917 to 1922.
I didn't know that. Another Virginian, yeah. And Wilson's the one who had the Supreme Court review that film that was a silent film that was a film, pro-Confederacy, anti-black film.
Oh, Birth of a Nation. He had a viewing of it in the White House and praised it. It was the second birth of the KKK, and its premiere is in the White House of the United States. And Woodrow Wilson, who is a racist Virginian of the worst sort, who resegregated the U.S. government, and who opposed women's suffrage until he had no choice but to get on board with it. This is not the most admirable man in human history, and you know that at Princeton, they have a really uneasy time of it now with Woodrow Wilson.
I was on the committee the American Historical Association has every 4 years. I was on for 12 years. Every 4 years, you have to vote on a ranking of all the presidents. And I always rank Washington first, Lincoln second, FDR third. But the interesting ones are the ones that are really low and go up, and the other ones that are sort of in the high middle, and then they go down. The latter is the man you just talked about. Wilson is sinking fast.
I'm afraid to say not as fast, but John Kennedy has been sinking a fair amount in the last couple of decades, now that we know so much more about him than we knew during those 3.5 years while he was president. FDR does not sink. Reagan continues to hold his place, and believe me, we would all take him now because he was an institutionalist, a constitutionalist. But he continues to hold his place. Lyndon Johnson's coming up a little, but Wilson is plummeting.
Eisenhower's coming up a lot.
Yes.
There's a lot of movement in the middle, which is itself a sign that, that history is not a stable all for one thing. It's going to keep shifting as our prism when we look back, and it's because race has become a prism that we now feel that we have to look through. That's going to affect a lot of the Southerners.
Joe, I have a couple of questions that are speculative, but I'm really eager for your answer. So, the Trump administration has said that it wants to end birthright citizenship, which is a clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, one of the three post-Civil War amendments. You would think, as a matter of pure rationality, the idea of precedent, that there's no way that the administration would ever be able to overturn an amendment to the Constitution that's that clear cut, but it could happen. You would think that invoking the Alien Enemies Act now, 200 years after it was ignominiously dismissed as one of the worst things that happened in the early national period, you would think that the courts would say, no, you've got to prove this is war. This is not a metaphoric war. There has to be due process. Obviously, there have to be hearings. There's no way you could just pluck people off the streets and deport them to El Salvador or Guantanamo or anywhere else. That's what you would think, right? But the way the Supreme Court has been behaving lately, led by Samuel Alito as one and Clarence Thomas as another, doesn't give me great confidence that they will oppose the Trump administration. I believe that there's a good chance that at least 4 members of the Supreme Court would vote with the Trump administration on the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship clause and would vote with him with respect to this. I think that Amy Coney Barrett might turn out to be a disappointment to the conservatives, and Brett Kavanaugh might prove to be a disappointment. I think that you can't rule out, I don't think, that the Supreme Court will side with the Trump administration on these questions.
I agree. It's unclear. I think that the Chief Justice's remarks suggest that he is going to side with the 3 liberal members, and if she does too, as was true in a recent vote, they can block it.
For which she got death threats, by the way. She voted against the conservative agenda, and she got death threats. People said she was a disaster.
But where you're correct is that more earlier than that, the decision in Trump versus U.S. will go down in history as the most unconstitutional, worst implication decision in American legal history. And that gives the president powers, official powers, that will avoid him being prosecuted in any way. And
that decision from last year, Joe, gives the president virtually unlimited power of immunity for anything that could be regarded in any sense as an official act of his presidency. You can hear James Madison spinning in his grave over something like that.
I agree. And it will take a constitutional amendment or a change in the court that's dramatic, it's not foreseeable, for that to be erased. The courts will ultimately rule on this. I hope they do it quickly. And my prediction is, because we're not at war, the law doesn't apply. But that one consequence of this, that the Trump base will be ignited. In other words, the people who believe in Trump in an almost religious way, as a kind of messiah, will see that this is an act that is prejudicial against their hero, so that even if he loses legally, I think he wins some votes politically.
Plus, I can see, and I want to be really fair here, this is what he told us he wanted to do. We were, under no illusions about these things. He does have control of both houses of Congress and maybe the Supreme Court. And if he doesn't get away with it, if the court strikes down this application, this executive order, or if the court strikes down his attempt to undo the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, he could ask Congress to pass a similar sort of law, the new Alien Enemies Law, with a little bit of due process. And if Congress passed it, it might hold up.
It could, but the margins in both branches are so small that it would require a majority in the Senate that they'll never get.
I just want to say again, as we take a break, elections matter. That having been said, the Constitution matters more. And what I find inexplicable, Joe, is that we are now kicking the Constitution around, maybe going to cancel it. I never, ever thought that could happen ever, and certainly not in my lifetime. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to take you back to the world of John Adams. Keep listening, everybody. We'll see you in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. So let me go back now to 1796, 1797, 1798. We have this tiny new country, population about 5 million. 1 in 5 is a slave. Most people, almost 80%, were within 50 miles of the eastern seaboard. It's still a very young country, and the states are still trying to figure out if they want to work together under the new Constitution. There's a lot of there's a terrible infrastructure. The country is not well connected. People in Georgia have never been to New Hampshire and vice versa, and know almost nothing about the other end of even the Atlantic coast. It's a very different country, and suddenly because of the French Revolution and the coming of Napoleon Bonaparte, the world is at war. And some historians have said that was really the First World War. But whatever we call it, the United States was terrified that we were going to get ground up in this thing somehow. And after an initial kind of harmony period with respect to the early French Revolution, almost everyone in the American establishment turned away from it in disgust. I think Adams said it was atheism and madness and so on. Jefferson is one of the few people who continued to support the idea of the French Revolution against the chaos that came. I'm only trying to provide some historical context here, Joe, so that it was a time of uncertainty. People were paranoid. They had reason to be fearful of what maybe the French Revolution spills back over to the United States and so on. So that's
well. Remember, Washington's farewell address is the classic statement for American isolation. This is not any of our concern. Why should we get involved with these foreign things? And our job is to occupy the continent. We don't look east, look west. That's the future for America. For 50 or 60 years, the reading of his words was a mandatory in the center of the House.
Text from George Washington.
Yeah, it was. Everything you said earlier is accurate about the state. And I will add this, that the first sentence of the most famous speech in American history is historically incorrect. Lincoln at Gettysburg.
7 years ago.
Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. No, they didn't. They brought forth a confederation of sovereign states. That was what the government was called, the Articles of Confederation. Which is pretty much what the Confederacy will argue for in 1860-61. The mentality, this is where you're right on target. The mentality of the bulk of the citizenry was local. The bulk of the people or farmers never traveled more than a 3-day horse ride from where they were born and died. As I used to have to tell my students, no, they didn't have cell phones.
Not wait a minute. Come on now.
Anyway, and so that the localism is one of the reasons they were extremely hostile to creation of any kind of national government. In fact, a national government would be the second coming of Parliament, which is what they fought the war to get away from. In order for the Constitution to occur and be passed, I've written about this, but they needed a coup d'etat. And there was one. And the three people that did it and then recruited Washington were
James Madison,
Alexander Hamilton, and the New Yorker, John Jay, excuse me. Yes. And they knew they had to recruit Washington to make it. And he was very reluctant to do it. But at any rate, the Constitution was written in an environment in which the vast bulk of the electorate really didn't want it. And it passed because the few people that approved it were able to persuade, and it had to be ratified as well. It was a really different time. It couldn't go all the way to a national institution and pass. So that Madison said, Madisonian democracy, some things still belong to the states and some things still belong to the national government, and we'll work out the details.
Indeed, yes. All right, so we have a new nation, and it's kind of the point we're making is it hasn't really gelled yet. It's certainly not the nation as we think of it in the 21st century. Profoundly local. People ate locally. They built their own world. They didn't import much. They didn't know much about faraway states like Vermont or Delaware, and didn't care much about all of that either. And they were a little bit railroaded into ratifying the new Constitution of the United States. And the Bill of Rights was one of the payoffs. That was a way of trying to assuage anti-federalist concerns. But all right, so we have this somewhat unstable country. And I think Jefferson was right, even as late as the Embargo Acts, which were a disaster too. But he was saying we shouldn't be fighting another war right now. We better wait. We better get a better economy. We better grow a little. We better sink some more roots. We better become more unified before we ever think of war again. And so he tried very hard to avoid a war with France or Britain in 1807. And John Adams was of the same view, that war was not the answer to America's problems, and he hoped that he could outlast the Quasi War and ratchet it down rather than ratchet it up, which he did, as you know, and that was his proudest achievement in his whole life, or certainly the proudest achievement of the presidency. But the Quasi War was real. Ships were boarded, goods were confiscated, captains were harassed, there were some arrests without due process, there were sinkings of American merchant ships, and so we were at war in some sense of the term, even though historians call it a quasi-war. And as you know, as an eminent American historian, every time the United States goes to war, for whatever reason, the central government becomes stronger, more authoritative, thin-skinned about dissent. It strikes out against its real or perceived enemies. This happened in World War I. It happened in World War II. It happened during the Korean War. It happened even to a certain degree during the war in Vietnam. War, and Madison knew this and Jefferson knew this, war strengthens central administration.
The executive branch, mostly, yes. Only one thing I'd add, that while Adams also wished to avoid war, he was an early and strong advocate for a navy and the buildup of American fleet. We don't want to fight a war, but we need to protect our coasts and protect our own ships. There ought to be a statue to him in Annapolis. And Jefferson, later on, when you get to the War of 1812, he was right. And, let's get him, Adams was right about this. And because that's going to mostly be a naval war on the Great Lakes. And in the correspondence between them in their latter years, Jefferson says, yeah, I should have listened to you.
One of the times when he actually said, you were right, he's twice,
right, yeah.
Once about the Navy. Adams was pretty gracious about that one. And then secondly, Jefferson said, you were right about the Reign of Terror too, and the dark turn.
The French Revolution.
You were right, I was wrong. So rare.
That was a big concession on his part. I mean, really, on Jefferson's part, that he got the French Revolution wrong. And when Adams got that letter, he said, "This is the finest letter I've ever gotten." He read it out loud to his kids or his grandkids. Said, "Look at this man. This is,
He's conceded. I'm right. I knew I was right all along. He's finally agreed to it."
Remember the line he said to Jefferson at the start of the course, "You and I ought not die until we have explained ourselves to each other."
So, Joe, I'm trying to get you to address this question. Yes, we look down on the alien, sedition, and naturalization laws. We see them for what they were, and deeply partisan, paranoid, an attempt to squelch dissent in a nation that has a First Amendment that invites dissent and protects it. We get that, right? Jefferson was right, and Madison was right. Adams was wrong. Hamilton was wrong. Abigail Adams was really wrong about all of that. But all administrations are thin-skinned. You and I both know that. Can the case be made that some form of the alien enemies law might have been okay, that some form of a sedition law might have been okay?
I think you could make the case as follows, that we're a newly born infant republic. Republics are most vulnerable in their infancy. They don't last long, usually. And therefore, any threat at this time needs to be opposed vigorously. And if the threat comes from immigrants or from whatever, that therefore a response to it is justified. Again, the person who cares more about the survival of the republic than anybody else is George Washington. And he's the one who says, yes, we have, I go along with this at this time. Alien and Sedition Acts.
It's hard for us to feel it, Joe, because it's so long ago. But I'm trying to figure out, how can we find an analogy? Think of the paranoia in this country at the time of the Russian Revolution 1917, and then how that followed us until the 1960s. Think of the paranoia in the United States when China went communist in 1946. I mean, these things are not small matters. There was, you remember, you were just a child, but you remember there was deep anxiety about communism and infiltration of communism and undesirable people in the Manhattan Project, in the Defense Department, in the State Department. They went way too far. We call that McCarthyism. We get it. But the paranoia happens on these circumstances, and then Congress or presidents often make really silly responses that turn out to be, as Jefferson said, palpably in violation of the Bill of Rights. But it is a part of the system, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the one that I would mention to add to your list is the Japanese internment. And the guy who was governor of California that put that into place later became Chief Justice.
Earl Warren.
And Earl Warren is the guy that did, I think he did his penance by Brown versus Board of Education. I think that the way I would put it is that from a historical perspective, what we need in those moments is leadership that acknowledges the fear but does not overreact to it, that tries not to use it for political purposes, but to control it for the long-term interest of the country.
I love that. You said that absolutely perfectly. We want leadership that sees the issue, is not afraid to face the world as it really is, and then says, what's the most thoughtful, careful, constitutionally protected, human rights protected way of addressing this issue in a responsible fashion? And here, I think I'm going to blame the Federalists in 1798. There were some wacko Federalists out there. I don't think John Adams was one of them, but I'm a little surprised that he didn't say behind the scenes, gentlemen, I don't know if you want to have an alien enemies law where there's no due process. You got to say that it was a colossal mistake by John Adams not to resist that, because he knew better. He knew better.
He did. I think part of the time he wasn't in the Capitol. He was back with Abigail, and the guy running the government was really Hamilton. I'm an apologist for Adams, but I love him because he's the most honest guy, and and unlike every of the other founders, he can't be mythologized because he's imperfect. And this is one of the moments that he is not what we want him to be.
And Joe, this question I want to ask, we just have a few minutes left, but I've been doing a lot of thinking about Jefferson lately and the Founding Fathers and so on. I know you have too, because we got to go somewhere looking for clarity and wisdom here. We want to go back to the well and see what they had in mind and what they feared. And they feared demagoguery in a big, big way.
Absolutely.
But the issue you just raised is so important. I would like to have an X-ray machine that could look behind every statement that Jefferson made or Madison made or Monroe made, even